other criticisms of like the left-right spectrum as well, such as like how do you measure populism, for example, or like libertarianism, like how do you cast those on this kind of spectrum. And that's a bit much to get into tonight, but you know, I'm happy to talk about that more. But for why not looking at polls is because other people are doing that. You know, like the Pew Research, that's what they do. Like they poll folks. And when you have, I think there's a limit to what you can reliably determine from polls. It's similar to the reason why I choose to focus on content analysis rather than polling people for their opinion of what the news is. Because some people are bad at telling what it is. Like, and so a segment of your population is not knowledgeable of what the positions are. And our elected officials get to make the actual laws and the actual policies. So I found that a better way to fix it. But, you know, you can fix it another way. Yeah?
I suppose I think it's a related question, but does your method take into account, I mean, it does take, as a party moves further left, or Republicans move further right, you set that as the norm rather than taking that into account. Right?
Yeah, because while we may think that like it's wrong to move a goalpost in a particular direction, like one of the criticisms I get from people who are like really well traveled is that like, oh, well, your center is actually quite right when you compare it to Europe. That's true. I mean, the center of American politics is right of where most European countries are. You know, Western European countries, right? But that we vote along those lines. Like the populace moves along those lines. You know, you would think like that's why like Florida is like 50-50 on everything. Like you vote, it's always 50-50 no matter like what year it is, what issue it is. I saw somebody on Twitter. This is not my joke. Somebody said you know, Florida could be voting between ice cream and getting kicked in the head, and it would be 50.5 to 49%.
Welcome to gerrymandering, right?
Yeah, okay, so here's a question. I'm going to start out talking about business, and then I switch to a related topic. But business is generally considered, I don't know, bipartisan right to skews left position. That's generally what you'll find. You'll have actual business sections in the newspaper in many news outlets, regardless of their situation. What you will not find is a labor section, which is probably considered skews left to maybe even most extreme left. And I'm just wondering how you would account for an absence like that. Because it just seems that's an obvious area of bias. I mean, you have people talking about how to train future business leaders of America, how to train future workers. You don't hear much about how to train future labor organizers, labor union people. Like positive labor union like achieves amazing thing. It's often like business chamber of commerce achieves awesome thing. So how does that fit into your taxonomy? And does that vacuum like in major coverage kind of falsify things? What's your take?
Absolutely. So topic selection and omission are like good first indicators of bias. It's the skew to the left and skew to the right. So if you look at, all right, so I have The Economist over here as skewing right. And a lot of people say, oh, The Economist doesn't skew right. If you read it, they're centrist, and they say liberalism, they mean they're a European publication, they mean European economic liberalism, which is like capitalism here is like the more right position here, right? So certain publications have built-in topic selection biases that just skew it to one side or the other. So for example, I don't have an example of one that's on here, but a publication that would talk primarily about issues like climate change, right? Those issues are important to people who skew left, even though climate change itself is not necessarily a very left topic, right? So there's, and all of these sources, if you step back a little bit, all of these sources have an inherent, what we call appropriate level of bias. It kind of reflects shared American morality, for example. Like, there are not a lot of things that we all agree on, but there are a few, like murder is bad, okay? Democracy is good, okay? like our system of like enterprise generally is pretty good. Okay, so there. Like free speech is good. That's a pretty broad one. Okay, there's not much else. A lot of it, everything, like I said, what was the second thing I said? Y'all were like, I don't know. We don't agree. We don't all agree. Democracy is good. Right, but at least for now, the publications have a bias. The democracy is good, right? All the publications share that bias, and we all share that free speech is good and freedom of the press is good. So even Fox News signs on to the amicus brief for CNN, right? So those biases we tend not to notice as much because they're. But then it, like the bias of the economists is like they print things that are of interest to capitalists, right? And that is a skews left kind of position. So it is that shades a source at the beginning. One way or the other, but then the actual treatment of the topic will push it farther right or left.
So is it like the main distinction, say, between the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, is it mainly story selection as opposed to the neutrality of the actual reporting once a story is selected?
Well, and also the like opinion and editorial section.
And the opinion page, of course.
Yes. Well, so that's weighted in there. Okay. So yeah, so that's why we want to create the dynamic
version. The main distinction is the opinion page and the story selection as opposed to the reporting?
Yes.
So this does include the opinion section of both?
Yes. Okay. And so imagine, if you will, I'm painting this vision for this thing that we're going to create, this dynamic interactive chart. So you have the New York Times, because people are like, oh, well you have it as ranking is high quality and skews left. But what about this terrible right-wing opinion article that they published, right? So you'd be able to click on the New York Times one and then see where that article fell and where all the other articles fell, and you can see that as like a weighted average.
So building off that, you said that like a terrible right-wing opinion they've written. I know a lot of those more prominent sources use a lot of guest columnists. Do you take guest columnists into consideration as well? Because wouldn't it be a little unfair if they're just guest columnists?
No, because they're the publication that's the source of it. Okay. So yeah, if they're we want to rate the content, not the person. And if people have asked me, can you just rate journalists like that? And no, because it's rude. People would be a lot angrier about that. It's very personal too, right? And it's like grading a student versus grading a paper. Like you don't want to tell somebody, like, you're a B. I mean, you could say this paper is a B, right? But your other one can be an A and your other one can be an F, yeah?
So if you were to pull out like the editorial section from some of these major publications, would it change where they fall?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because really, like, it's not just the reporter or the person writing it, it's the editorial board that's making those decisions.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. It's what the content as itself, what it's doing. So here are the two types of bias, political bias that we account for: political position bias and linguistic bias. So political position bias is the issue itself. So one of the ways we rank this is I picked 19 topics. So the reason I picked these 19 political topics are like immigration, taxes, defense spending, LGBT, civil rights, a bunch of political issues. There's a lot of them. I went to Senator Cory Gardner's website and Senator Michael Bennett's website and kind of picked from the drop-down menu of things you could contact them about, and they each had something in each of those categories, right? So there's certainly more we could add, but a particular article will talk about usually one main political issue, and then there could be like 2 to 3 ancillary issues, right? So the main topic is immigration. You might also have other ones like there might be tax issues also in there, like economic spending issues in there, and like national security issues in there. So, but the main one would be immigration. So the position that the article is advocating for or just reporting on neutrally would be one way to rate the political bias. So if the position that the article is taking is we should build a wall and we should restrict legal immigration. That's like hyper-partisan to most extreme right. Okay, the restrict legal immigration is over here. And the build a wall is like right here, okay? If you're saying increase, make it easier to legally immigrate to the United States, that's a skews left position. Let in more refugees, also like a skews left to hyper-partisan left immigration position. But then there are the ways in which you discuss the topic itself, because you can appear to take a facially neutral position on immigration, but if you're saying, what are all the ways to talk about people who are in this country illegally? It's undocumented immigrants, illegal immigrants, illegal aliens, illegals, okay? So that's a way to measure those. It's a moving target, which we talked about. All right, so part two, the other hard part is the methodology. So it's content analysis driven, like I discussed. And I believe that it is possible to grade media content according to a standardized rubric, just like it is possible to grade academic content, which is also written and largely subjective, written by a human, graded by a human, right? And those are all scored on scales of 1 to 5 or 1 to 6. But the graders come within usually a point of each other. And there are ways to train those graders and ways to ensure that outliers don't badly affect your result. And so that's what we're attempting to do here. So there's subjective graders and writers in an objective scale here. This requires, when it comes to an article, breaking down ratings into really granular components in order to minimize subjectivity. We are all humans, we all have biases, there's nothing we can do about that fact, but we can control for those things by doing a couple things. One is trying to control for your own bias does work. That's what journalists do, is try to control for bias. And then breaking it down to a unit where you can agree on something with somebody else who politically disagrees with you. Let me give you examples of that. All right.
Do you have multiple people looking at the same story to make a decision?
Yes, that's the design of our upcoming study.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's because this is like everything I'm talking about up to this point, and like up to this point in time, it's really been like me doing this by myself. And I have recruited analysts, and I've got like a big list of analysts of people from different political backgrounds that are going to be helping me do this exact thing right now. So the design of the initial study is going to have 4 people looking at one article. It's a lot of reading. So yes. Two left, two right, center-ish. So the current approach is all manual, and it's really time-consuming and really labor-intensive, and it's like not sustainable and scalable. I think there's a way to scale it. I am in the tech startup world, and machine learning and AI. It is possible. It is possible to do this, but you have to get the human part right first. And that is why this hasn't been done correctly by any tech companies yet. Is because this part is really what to measure is hard. You can't be like you can't feed an article to a machine and say this is skews left and low quality, and then feed in another one and have it tell you the same thing, because there's so many different ways that article could look. So we want to go really granular first in order to be able to scale this in the future. So here's an example article grading rubric. This is something that will evolve over time, but so you have your, I know that's kind of hard to see, but you have your title, your graphic, your lead, or chyron in the shows, and then anything else that's in there. You can score that by itself, and then you can score sentences. I'll use that on the other, I'll talk about that on the other slide. Judge unfairness, and then judge bias for topic selection and presentation on this left to right scale. This goes into a bit more depth. So the quality rankings are based on rating the headline and the graphics. Those are both really key, and they get heavily weighted in our formula because a lot of the times people only see the headline and the graphics. I mean, I don't know what the statistic is, but something like 80% of the people who like see the headline would not read the article, and sometimes people will just share it even without reading, which is those studies have been disturbing.
So would the methodology also look at just the general construction of it? Then you have the headline, you have the graphics. I used to be a media critic for like 3.5 years or so, but like one of the things that I definitely always looked at was what was the what was the lead, and then what was the lead, right? Like what was that final little piece at the very end? And there was always like I would take the same story across 4 or 5 different sources, and they all wrote the exact same thing, but it was more about what the structure was and how they were telling the story through. It would kind of like bring out the bias there.
Yeah, the order matters.
Yeah, exactly.
And also the matching of the headline and the story really matters. If the headline and the story don't match, that's like a really it heavily weights the quality score downward. So this is all like weighted algorithm stuff. Because if you read a headline and you think based on the headline one thing, then you read the article and it's a totally opposite thing, that's terrible. All right, so rating each sentence. This gets like super granular, super nerdy. How are we on time? Gosh, yeah. Did you have a question? No.
Yeah,
okay.
Sure. Okay. It seems like what you're doing is assuming headlines that are written for a search engine environment. Okay, for online sources. But I was a magazine editor, and our headlines were very, very vague. They're frequently puns, plays on language, come-ons. They don't tell you a lot. How do you handle that?
Yeah, so you actually, you can get points for being clever. You can get quality points for being, a good headline would be something that's not misleading, tells you what the story is, and if it's clever, even better. You don't get, knocked for being clever in a headline. But, and vague is okay. Vague would get a slightly lower score, but it depends on the type of vagueness. Vague to be misleading.
How this headline? China hand. What was that so?
That's that headline?
Yeah.
And what's the article about?
It was my profile of this casino dude in Hong Kong.
It's called China Hen?
China hand.
Yeah? China Hen.
It's an old-fashioned phrase. It doesn't mean anything to those who don't,
Right. Right. So probably a score. I'd have to see what my raters would come out with, but that would probably get a middling score.
Got a lot of those.
Yeah. Yeah. So rating. Go ahead.
So I guess my question would be have you ever looked at your metrics over time? So so something that would lean right. So let's say the Republican Party platform moved from discussing illegal immigration to now using illegal aliens. Wouldn't that shift a lot of things toward the center that it doesn't give you any sense of normalizing extremes?
Yeah. So it's like I said, it's all very dynamic. Yeah. And so there are a couple ways to address it. Again, they're hard, but you have. So we have these set. Imagine this grid with these 19 topics, and we have our words and positions that match up with the most extreme left to most extreme right. You also, so when we have the article raters rating them, they will also identify new things that need to go into that grid, right? Because, and some of these change ideally in the future we'll be able to adjust this on a micro level. So here's an example. During the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, there was a couple of days where somebody talked about Brett Kavanaugh having gotten in bar fights when he was younger. And the term bar fights appeared a lot in Twitter and stories and people, and so it became if you were saying being in bar fights as a young man is a good thing, that was a skews right position or a hyper-partisan right position. Or if you're saying being in bar fights as a young man is terrible and the worst idea ever, that would be a hyper-partisan left position. Now, bar fights wouldn't even show up as a metric on most days. But that is something that you can use, and you can put that into the system. This would require a lot of data science. This would require lots of. It would have to be automated at this point. But we can measure those changes by adjusting it every 6 months or so for now.
Because if one platform is consistently moving to more extreme, the goalpost is going to stay fixed. So it doesn't give you any scale of. If, let's say, the Democratic platform stays fixed for 10 years, and the Republican platform tends to move further right, the distribution between them is going to stay fixed in your
So it's gonna, the reason we fixed it is because that's how the voters move too.
Yeah.
Right? And that's how the media coverage moves too. That's why it's 50-50 in Florida, right? I mean, there are certain things, about like race that candidates in this race, in this election have said that would have been disqualifying 4 years ago. So the goalposts have moved. So, and the voters have moved as well. So since the voters moved, like, you may not like it, but the voters are over there and the media's over there as well. So you gotta capture it. All right, so I want to talk about the sentences themselves, because the sentences tell you so much. You gotta look at each sentence, and they can tell you things on the true-false scale for veracity. And Snopes does this, the PolitiFact does this. They rate things on a scale of very true to very false, on a scale of like 1 to 6. Because there are things that are like mostly true and neither true nor false. And we want to capture each one of those. It's not just a matter of fake news or not. But there's another way that you can measure a sentence, which is how is it expressed. So if it can be expressed as 1, a fact statement, 2, fact with a little bit of analysis, 3, analysis, 4, analysis plus opinion, and 5, purely opinion. So some of these sentences, like you could say something that is, if you say something completely false, like verifiable, not verifiable, or you can disprove it easily. But if you say it as a fact statement, like if you say the earth is flat, okay, it's a 5 for veracity, it's a 1 for fact statement. If you print that, that's bad, it's a lie, okay? But if you say, I think the world, I think based on my view of things, the world is flat, it seems flat. So that's like 5, that's an opinion statement. So you get more credit for that. So so what we count as opinions are things that are 3, neither true nor false. So government corruption is absolute, but stated as a fact. So something that's a 3 for veracity, but a 1 for a fact statement is what we normally in parlance call an opinion. Alright, but there are other things that, like, it can be totally true and totally factual and still unfair. So you can, for example, throwing in something that's not timely. Like if the story is about a terrible thing that a person did today, it's extra unfair to also point to the terrible thing that same person did 20 years ago. It's kind of like, like in the rules of evidence, you don't want to bring in like hearsay or things that are not timely. That's kind of where the unfairness metric came from. That's kind of my background. So bias, they're scored most extreme, most to the right. So it's selected topic, selection, and presentation, and sentence level scoring. Instances of political position bias, like I mentioned before. Characterization is another thing. So this is like name calling or characterization of a political opponent. Like if you're calling somebody crafty, that's like a slightly negative connotation. If you're calling them like senile or decrepit or like a bad word, that's a worse characterization, more bias. Those also affect quality. And then terminology bias, like pro-life, pro-choice, death tax versus the state tax, etc. And then comparison. So here's the other part why it's really hard for purely tech solution to this, is because the topic selection and comparison metrics are the most critical for measuring bias by omission. So bias by omission, you have to know what should be in that story that's not. So how do you know that? So one of the best examples that illustrates this, you guys remember when the Devin Nunes memo came out? Okay, so the Nunes memo was like this big political story that everyone was like waiting on for a few days. Everybody had like their spin ready and all that. But it was a really fact-dense story. You had to know a lot of things about politics and like inside baseball in Washington. Like you had to know that Devin Nunes is the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. You had to know that what a FISA warrant is and a FISA court, and you had to know what the dossier was, and you had to know what Michael Flynn's involvement was, and all this stuff, right? And so when the memo came out, it was like a 4-page memo. And so there's already 4 pages of text to decipher there. So one of the best articles about it was like an annotated Washington Post column. And it was long. I mean, it was like, I don't know, 8,000, 10,000 words, but it had all the facts that were in there and annotations. But then if you wanted to see the bias in the other sources, you know, if you looked on the left, it was like, see this bond, this is a nothing burger, you know? This is a total sham, this proves absolutely nothing. And then on the left, you know, on Fox it'd say, bombshell memo drops. Here are all the things that Hillary Clinton did wrong. So it was two totally different extremes. But one, it's not just the headlines that you could tell what was missing. Like, they had to select what they were going to print. Especially, a lot of those sources, their readers don't want to read 10,000 words, right? They want to read like maybe 1,000, maybe 200, right? So what are you going to leave out? And what you can leave out, you would only know if you read the Washington Post one. Okay, and you would only know what's what the left is including, what the right is including, by having read that Washington Post one. So you can't tell a machine to rate what's not in there. That's why we need humans to do it for now. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here. The detailed baseline really helps, especially when it comes, because to casual observers, things seem the same. So how are CNN, MSNBC, and Fox different? I will tell you I get a lot of opinions about all of these channels, and especially their placements on the chart. So some folks will say CNN needs to be in the exact opposite place of Fox on your chart, so on the other side. And other people will say MSNBC needs to be in the exact opposite place on your chart, opposite from Fox. Now both of those things cannot be true, right? It kind of depends on the perspective of the person. So what should we look at in these shows? Like, yes, one's up, one's right, you kind of know that. But there's so much you can look at in addition to the sentences for shows. Okay, so you have the things that host says and all their sentences and all their graphics and things like that. But then you have the guests. And the guests are just this treasure trove of telling you about quality and bias. So first here you have the guest type. And the reason I have 10 columns here is because you can have like 10 guests on one show, which is obnoxious. Here are the buckets that the types of guests generally fall in. There are more, but these are general. So you can have a politician guest, you can have a journalist from like another newspaper, so MSNBC will have on the Daily Beast, etc. You can have another news show host from the same channel, so Chris Hayes will show up on, or Joy Reid will show up on MSNBC too. You can have a paid or regular contributor. You can have a guest contributor. You can have a guest interviewee, paid or unpaid. You can have a political or institutional spokesperson or advocate. For example, a spokesperson for the White House, a book author or a cause promoter. And so those are kinds of the buckets that they fall into. Now the guest will have a political stance on that particular subject that you can rate on the scale of most extreme right to most extreme left, okay? And the guest will also have an expertise level on that subject matter, from very low, 1, to very high, okay? This is where the differentiation really starts to come to the surface. So a 1, you have somebody that's like, either unqualified or no more qualified than any of us in the room who watch news to comment on the political happenings of the day. Like if you have a celebrity just coming onto the news to talk about like what they think about the news, why? That person has low expertise on the subject matter. If you were talking about national security or like intelligence issues, and you have a former director of the CIA, that person has high expertise on that subject matter. That would be like a 5. And then there's the host posture metric. So the host posture is what is the host doing in relation to that guest, because that influences the bias of the segment. So you can have, here are the kind of buckets those fall into as well. So you have cheerleading and advocating, sensationalistic or hyperbolic, hostile or opposing, sympathetic, providing a platform or neutral, challenging, information gathering for facts or information gathering for opinion or analysis. So let's take an example. If you have Paul Ryan, who is a politician, and then he's talking about tax reform, and his political stance on the subject would be like the Republican Party line, so hyperpartisan right, and his expertise on the subject matter, since he would helped really push through this legislation, would be high, like he'd be a 5 on expertise. So So that show segment depends a lot on the host posture metric. If he's invited to talk about that subject on Fox and Friends, then that'd be like a cheerleading, advocating, or a platform, providing platform/neutral type of situation. So the stance of the segment would be the same. It'd be hyper-partisan right. But if he goes on Rachel Maddow and she's drilling him on what and asking him for information, but information is, or it could be like opposing, or it could be information gathering, opinion, or analysis, that would make it a more neutral segment, okay? Or even a skews left segment. Make sense? So you can measure all these different show rubrics. And here are some subcharts for the shows. I watched a lot of cable news. It was a lot of fun watching all this cable news. And, you know, it is. There are so many of them. There are so many shows. And you can watch it all day long. And, you know, some of them I had not seen before, actually. I mean, some of these shows you might not be familiar with at all. So there's one in the morning that's like, typically like 12 stories or so. It's kind of like, you know, things that happen across the country, maybe international stories, some national weather, some sports stuff, like, you know, news. And then you have a lot of the major primetime programming is, you know, stuff Trump did and said today and why it's bad, okay? And then Fox News. So what I thought was interesting. All right, you know, and you know, I get criticism from this as like being biased, like reflecting my own bias or whatever. But when you break it down to these things, like I want to show these things to be repeatable. This could change when we have more analysts rating it. That's fine. I'd be happy if it changed because then you know it'd have more credibility to it. But I think you'll find similar things. So like. Here, a lot of the shows cluster in this area. It's opinion analysis, skews left. But there's a really broad range on Fox News, and it appeals to like I think a wider segment of the population than people would initially realize. So, America's Newsroom and Shepard Smith reporting, you know, there's skews right. There's mostly news. There's analysis. Like it's a little right. Like you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that it's like. Yeah, on a very skewed, hyper-partisan right overall network. But then there are certain shows like Justice with Judge Jeanine and Hannity. And Hannity's on like prime time at 8 o'clock, and you can like sit there and I did this. Like you sit there and like he says a sentence and then you rate it. Like okay, well that's a 5 and a 1. Like it's not true, or that's a 3 and a 1. It's a 3 and a 1. It's a 5 and a 3. Like on the veracity score. And you can, when you see those numbers, those are things that like people of different political stripes can agree on when they're rating a particular sentence. So it's just it's really heavy opinion and a lot of misleading information in some of these shows, whereas this is just more like beating a subject to death. Is the crime here? Is the crime? And then so Msnbc is a lot like Fox, just more advocating, like specifically advocating for policy positions, and the concentration of guests advocating for those positions is more hyper-partisan.